maybe it'd be okay to get started. Do you want to pull up the presentation? Great, thank you. And Alan, if you want to kick us off, I'll be happy to take the baton and do introductions when we get there. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Great, thanks. First, let me say welcome and thank you everybody for participating today. I am the Executive Director of District and School Performance at the Department of Education. And this is the Accountability Task Force, a group of shareholders that we pulled together to assist the department in making decisions around accountability. I just want to first point out that we work every day at the department to fulfill the vision and mission of the agency and their strategic goals of the agency. And we would expect that those of you in this group would also help the department to do the same. So just wanted to point out that the vision is to create a world-class educational system that gives students the knowledge and skills to be successful in college and the workforce and to flourish as parents and citizens. And the mission is to provide leadership through the development of policy and accountability systems so that all students are prepared to compete in a global community. Accountability touches on all 6 of the strategic plan goals of the State Board of Education, as you'll see in this table here. And we'll speak more in depth about these goals today as we go over the accountability system and the expectations for the Accountability Task Force and the work that we have coming forward. So we'll start by going through welcome and introductions, a roll call, if you will, and I'll pass that back to Dr. Domalewski.
Thanks, Alan. And hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces. Many of you are familiar, and also looking forward to getting to know some new participants in this group. My name is Chris Domalewski. I work with a group called the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. We're based in Dover, New Hampshire. Well, it's probably a little chillier here than it is where you are. I'm jealous. And we are, our organization's been working with the department for many years, providing technical support for assessment and accountability. And it's my pleasure to help support this task force as your facilitator. So thank you for allowing me to serve in that role. Let's hear who we have with us today. We'll go through introductions and then we'll turn it back over to the department for updates and for a review to get us started. So maybe when I call your name, if you could just go off mute and say hello, tell everybody what your name and organization and role is. And that way we can both check to make sure that we can hear you and you can hear us, and we'll get a chance to learn who's on the call today. So let's start with Ms. Altman, Board Member Altman. Are you on with us this afternoon? Okay. Rosemary Altman. How about Crystal Bates? Crystal, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
And Crystal, you want to share your organization and role?
I'm from Wayne County High School. I'm over the curriculum and data.
Great, thanks for joining us, Crystal. Latoya Blackshear.
I'm present. My name is Latoya Blackshear. Good to see everyone. I am the Director of Planning and Evaluation for Jackson Public Schools.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Latoya. We're glad you're here. Lindsay Brett.
Hi, I'm here. I'm Lindsay Brett, and I'm the principal of Plainsville Middle School.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Jermaine Brown.
Hello, I'm Jermaine Brown, Hattiesburg Public Schools, Director of College and Career Readiness, Central Office Administrator here.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. Angela Birch. Is Angela Birch on the call today? Okay, you got to hear from Alan just a moment ago. He's with the department. Alicia Connerly.
Yes, that's correct. I am here. I am the team leader, also known as the principal of Lawrence County, in Lawrence County, but the principal of Monticello Elementary School.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have introduced myself, Deborah Donovan. Is Deborah on the call today? Oh, you know what? I think she was going to join us late, as I recall. So we'll look forward to having Deborah join us a little later. Board member East, Glenn East. I thought I heard a little audio, but I'm not sure. Is Glenn East on with us? How about Stephen Hampton, Superintendent Hampton?
Yes, I'm here. Stephen Hampton, Lamar County School District Superintendent.
Thank you. Raina Holmes.
Good afternoon. My name is Raina Holmes. I'm the head principal at Main Place High School.
Thank you so much for joining us, Raina. Is Christy Hopenitz with us today?
Hey, Chris. Christy Hovanitz. I'm a senior policy fellow at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, which is a national nonprofit that does work in K-12 education.
So glad you're back with us again this year, Christy. You'd think as long as we've worked together, I've learned to say your name properly. I'll keep working on that.
Okay.
How about Lawrence Hudson, Superintendent Hudson?
Yes, Lawrence Hudson, Superintendent of Western Line School District.
Thank you for joining us. Tamika Highland.
Hello, my name is Tamika Highland. I'm the principal of Vicksburg High School.
Thank you for joining us. Teresa Jones. I said that wrong, I'm sure. Tereshana Jones, perhaps?
Taranasha Jones. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm the Director of Alternative Programs here at Greenville Public School Districts.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. How about Ryan Kirkendall?
Good afternoon, Ryan Kirkendall, Director of Accountability and Research for DeSoto County Schools. I'm also Mississippi's LEA rep for the National Forum on Education Statistics.
Fantastic. I'm glad you're back with the group again, Ryan. I always appreciate your contributions. Lisa Renee Lamatis.
Yes, hi, I'm Renee Lamastis. I'm the principal of Hayes Cooper Center in Marigold, Mississippi, but we are part of the Cleveland School District.
Great. Thank you, Renee. Greg Paxick.
Greg Pazak, Madison County Schools, Director of Research and Development.
Great. Thank you. Glad you're back again. William Robertson, Superintendent Robertson.
I'm Bradley Robertson, Superintendent of the Oxford School District.
Sure, I get your first name down correct. Thank you very much. Glad you're with us. Robert Sanders.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Sanders. I'm the Assistant Superintendent here in the Hinds County School District.
Thank you for being with us. Dr. Vanderford.
Good afternoon. I'm Paula Vanderford, the Chief Accountability Officer, and I would just like to take this opportunity to echo what Alan said at the beginning of the call, and thank you all for your participation and willingness to assist as we work to review or revise any of the business rules that you may deem necessary.
Thank you so much. And LaVonda White.
Good afternoon, LaVonda White, Rankin County School District, Director of Accountability, Accreditation, and Assessment.
Fantastic. Well, we have a great turnout for our first meeting. I'm really grateful to everybody for participating. Let me just do another check for anybody who didn't get a chance to introduce themselves and greet us today, maybe because I I may have missed you on the way through, or you joined us after I called your name.
Yeah, we have Angela Birch. And Angela, are you muted?
Hi, I'm Angela Birch, principal of Central Elementary in the Pascagoula Goshen School District.
Thank you for joining us, Angela.
Thank you.
And I believe we have some MDE staff that aren't on the list but are attending today. So if they want to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. I'm Sandra Robertson from the Office of School Improvement.
And I'm Sandy Whiten, and I'm the Director of Accountability Services.
Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Clemens. I am here representing the Office of Career and Technical Education.
So glad that all of you have joined us. One last call to see if there's anybody who's yet to introduce themselves this afternoon. Okay, let's move on to the next slide if we can. So here's a glimpse of what we're hoping to accomplish this afternoon. After we finish with a little more opening logistics and context setting, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Burrow to give us some background on accountability in Mississippi. It's always good to start with a strong foundation of understanding. He has excellent content and message to share there. Then we're going to go, we're going to transition to talk about the ESSA amendment that's proposed, and we've got some FYI things to share with you. We have a decision that we want to check with the task force on regarding TSI exit criteria. We'll say more about that when it comes. We'll take a break around 3, but we always try to stay flexible. We don't ever know exactly how long these topics will take, and we try to give them the time that they're due. Then we'll shift to industry certification self-reporting, and then we'll end with sort of a broader reflection about accountability foundations to support a conversation about what topics we want to prioritize for the future. And we will be sure to adjourn by 5 o'clock. And veteran members of the task force, this will be familiar to you, but maybe it's a helpful reminder. And for new members, we want to help everybody understand what the purpose and overview of this group is. We gather to help the MDE make good decisions about design and implementation of the state school accountability system that is implemented in fulfillment of the Every Student Succeeds Act. I've worked with a lot of states, and I always want to take a moment to note that Mississippi is second to none when it comes to their commitment to working collaboratively with stakeholders and decision makers. And so I think it's terrific that this group exists, and I appreciate the collaboration that the department exhibits and working so openly and transparently with everybody. We really try to focus on policy priorities. Sometimes the conversations get a little technical, but we really try to have it be less about very detailed nuts and bolts or dense technical topics, and really try to make sure our conversations, if not totally focused, are at least heavily grounded and a clear sense for what we want to accomplish and what priorities that we want to elevate, so that we can always make sure that any recommendation that comes from the committee is really consistent with the department's values, with their policy priorities, and that we can make a strong case that this is what's in the best interest of elevating student achievement throughout the state of Mississippi. So we'll try to make sure that we clearly link to those priorities every time we bring a topic to this body, and all our recommendations are again grounded in a strong rationale. The feedback from the task force is received as a recommendation. I think that's probably well known, but it bears explicitly stating there are, as with any initiative of this nature, there are multiple decision makers at multiple levels. I can tell you that in my interactions with the department, the Accountability Task Force is highly influential, but it's not the only decision maker. So sometimes we take feedback from this group, and it may change before it goes through all channels of decision making. Very often your feedback is adopted, but we do receive it as a recommendation. Next slide, please. We'd like to be very clear about some of our norms or our rules for working together. As with any effective group, we always hope that people will listen actively and attentively. Don't worry about asking for clarification as needed, whether we're in person or remote. We really like to think of ourselves as a working group. So we typically avoid a lot of formal Robert's Rules of Orders, and we really just want to create an environment where people feel free to speak up and share their perspectives. I'll try as your facilitator to always make sure you have you feel that you have ample opportunity to be heard and to put your contributions out there. So don't be shy about that. When we're remote, we'll watch the chat, we'll watch for hand raises, and there'll be plenty of times that we just say, take yourself off of mute and speak up. So we hope you avail yourself to any of those channels. We want everybody to be heard, as I noted, without interruption, receive courteous feedback. Good rule of thumb is if you have a critique, focus on the ideas, not the people, the organization, or the presumed motivations. Conversations about accountability sometimes can elicit spirited conversations and disagreement among reasonable people. And we want to try to navigate through those as cordially and respectfully as possible. In my experience, that's never been a problem with this group. This group has always been really terrific when it comes to being collaborative and working together with just the utmost of professionalism. We do try, I mentioned earlier, we try to avoid very formal kinds of ways of operating because we want it to feel very much like a working group, as a discussion group. When we do have different points of view, we try to work towards a shared understanding. So if we can really find out where we agree and build off of that, that would be our preference. But again, veteran members of the group will know occasionally we do take votes, and occasionally those votes aren't unanimous. And when that's the case, we will note what the preference of the group is, and we may also note what the dissenting point of view is, so that those that are watching or those that are reading our meeting summaries will get a sense for the range of viewpoints that were shared. To my knowledge, these meetings are all fully public, so I don't think you are going to ever have confidential information. If it's confidential, I don't think we'll be able to bring it to this meeting. We'll be operating openly. I don't think, Alan mentioned this meeting's not being broadcast in real time, but this will be recorded and will be shared. So just be aware that it will be public. And if ever we do have an occasion where we need to be discreet about information, we'll be sure to share that with the group. And then, as I noted earlier, at the end of every meeting, we'll work to prioritize topics for future meetings. Very often we will come to these meetings, as we've done today, with a couple of topics that we want your advice on and that we need your guidance on. And that we'll always ask you at the end of each meeting, what would you like us to prioritize as we look forward? What are some issues that maybe you didn't see on the agenda that you'd like to see in the future? And we will end today's meeting with that very question. So if anything comes to mind throughout the meeting, feel free to share it with us then. So let me pause here and ask, I hope people are okay with the way we operate and the norms. I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments about that before we move on. Terrific. Well, without further delay, then I'm going to pass the baton back to Alan and his colleagues. I don't know if there's any additional updates from the department or if you want to get right into your remarks about the accountability system.
Okay, Paula, do you have any updates that you'd like to discuss at this point before we move forward?
I think I need to plug my battery in. No, I do not have any at this time. Dr. Benton may join us. She had to have another call earlier. This was originally on her calendar, and we do hope that our new superintendent, Dr. Taylor, will be able to join us at a February meeting, and hopefully we'll be able to have that meeting in person. So just if Dr. Benton joins us later, I'm sure she'll take the opportunity to say hello. Or later, not earlier, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we hope to have these meetings in person again. We didn't for this one for a couple reasons, because there was kind of a last minute scheduling, but also difficulty in arranging space for this many people at the moment. So we'll hopefully be in person next meeting. So what we usually do when we start the Accountability Task Force meeting is do an overview of accountability in current policies in Mississippi. Just as a refresher, but also we have people, you as a member of the Accountability Task Force are not expected to be an expert in accountability. Certainly you likely have some knowledge of accountability and how it works, but we include members of the task force from all different perspectives and roles within their districts, intentionally to get your varying viewpoints. And so we don't like I said, we don't expect you to be an expert in all the details that is accountability. So feel free to ask questions at any point. Don't feel like you may have a dumb question. That's certainly not the case. We're glad to help you. But we'll step through accountability just as an overview before we get started. And then if you have any questions, I'll be glad to address those. So I like to start talking about accountability in the larger scope. Looking at what do accountability systems seek to achieve in the bigger picture. And first of all, accountability systems work to establish a set of minimum standards, standards that are held equitably across schools and districts in our state that help to ensure that students are prepared to compete in a national workforce or go on to post-secondary education. And secondly, the accountability system works to inform the public on how well schools and districts are performing. And the accountability system considers how well students perform on state assessments and whether students are showing improvement year over year and whether students are graduating on time. But also, as we know, accountability systems drive behavior in schools and districts and influences planning, measures of interim performance, and results in consistent best practices across districts within the state. And those, hopefully we can see that those practices result in desirable outcomes such as improvement on statewide assessments and national standardized assessments such as NAEP. So what did accountability what did it look like before now? The first accountability system in Mississippi was in 1988. This system established ratings between 1 and 3 based on student performance at the district level only. Then the next iteration was in 1995 when districts were rated 1 through 5 based on student performance. Again, only districts were rated. In 2003, schools now had a rating, a level between 1 through 5 based on performance and growth. And the next iteration was in 2009, where districts and schools had a rating system of 1 through 7 rating system. This one was also based on performance and growth, but there was also a completion index that was included. That included various ways of completing and graduation, not necessarily just a 4-year graduation rate. And then in 2013, the current model was implemented. It has changed a little bit over the years since then as things have been added or adjusted. But essentially, the bigger picture, the larger structure of the model has remained intact. So that model, the current model is established in Mississippi Code and is established as a single A through F statewide accountability system that is compliant with both state and federal regulations regarding accountability. It was approved by the State Board of Education January 17th of 2014, and it was developed in collaboration with many different stakeholders, like the Accountability Task Force, the Technical Review Committee, state legislative leaders, and MDE leadership. And we continue to work in that process to engage multiple stakeholders whenever we make changes to accountability. So this is the Mississippi Code where it is addressed. As I mentioned, it is a combined state and federal accountability system. We have summative ratings of A through F, whereas the previous system had descriptors such as star, high performing, successful, low performing. This statute also incorporated a standards-based growth model. It mandated that there be the discontinued use of QDI, which was a quality of distribution index, which is an index measure given to schools and districts that wasn't particularly clear to the public in interpretation. It mandated that we had a federally compliant 4-year graduation rate, and that we discontinue the use of the high school completion index, which, as I mentioned, considered other types of completion status. And then there's the requirement that standards be reset when 75% of students are proficient and or when 65% of schools or districts earn a B or higher grade. So that's looking at the state side of things for accountability. This slide here, which I credit to the Foundation for Excellence in Education, thank you, Christy, I think does a good job of summing up the federal requirements. So as I mentioned, we have a system that complies with both state and federal requirements. On the federal side, we are required to establish long-term goals for academic achievement, high school graduation, and English language proficiency. Those goals should be accomplished through our school accountability system. States have a good bit of flexibility on their accountability systems, but we have some broad categories that we have to fit our indicators into, and those are academic achievement indicator, another academic indicator such as growth or grad rate, English proficiency, and an additional indicator of school quality or student success. And we use that accountability system and those indicators that are selected by the state to advise for school support. And so those are the federal identification of schools, which we'll talk about today around this amendment, but that is the comprehensive support and improvement schools, targeted support and intervention schools, and additional targeted support and intervention schools. Those are our federal identifications. So our accountability system looks at proficiency, or how did the student meet expectations. We look at growth. Did the student improve year over year? Participation. Did the student participate in assessments? And graduation rates. Did the student graduate as expected and on time? Our assessments that are included in accountability are 3 through 8 assessments in reading and math, high school intercourse assessments in English 2 and Algebra 1, and then we have MAP-A, or the alternate assessment, in 3 through 8 and high school intercourse assessments in reading and math. We also measure proficiency in grades 5 and 8 science, biology, and U.S. history intercourse assessments, but we don't measure growth for those assessments. There's only one assessment that we give in the state that is not required by the federal government, and that's the U.S. history intercourse assessment. This slide is a visual of our growth system and how we calculate growth. There's many different ways of calculating growth. We could have a full day lesson on those different various ways. In Mississippi, we have this transition table. So we look at how does a student progress across proficiency levels from year to year. And as you know, we have 5 proficiency levels on the state assessment, with 4 and 5 being considered proficient. 4 is proficient, 5 is advanced. And we measure growth in smaller increments across the bottom 3 proficiency levels. So we have a 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B. and we measure growth across those levels. There's also some additional weighting for when students exceed growth expectations, and that's the 1.25 that you see in this graphic. So if a student crosses a proficiency level, so goes from a 1A or 1B, crosses 2 completely and goes to a 3, there's an additional bonus weighting of 0.25 for that growth measure. Also, if students move to the advanced level or level 5 from any lower level, there's a 1.25 for growth. And you'll see that also in the graph. There's also a 1.25 awarded for a student that achieves advanced and stays advanced from year to year. Okay, so all of those indicators are weighted and have points assigned to them. As we see in this table, this is the table for elementary and middle schools. So we measure proficiency in reading, math, and science, as I previously mentioned. We also measure growth of all students in reading and math. And we measure the growth of the lowest performing 25% of students in reading and math. And so you'll see by this table that growth is heavily weighted in the accountability system in Mississippi, and that students that are performing in the lowest quartile are weighted heavily in the accountability system, as they're included in growth in both the lowest 25% growth of all students and their proficiency measures. We also have English language progress, which was an addition of the ESSA federal requirement that was added recently, just a few years ago. And so if a school has at least, if the school has the minimum requirement count of students for English language progress, then 35 points are assigned to that indicator. If not, then all of these other indicators that you see in this table would be increased to 100 points. And this is the table for high schools and districts. So again, here we have reading and math proficiency and growth consistent with elementary middle schools. We have science proficiency, but we also have U.S. history proficiency. We have the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate that is heavily weighted, 190 points. Acceleration, we look at both performance and participation and acceleration. College and career readiness looks at ACT and ACT work keys. And then again, the English language progress indicator. And again, if a high school or a district doesn't have the minimum count of EL students, then these points assigned to the English language progress indicator go back to those other performance indicators. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the acceleration component and how that works. So acceleration has, as I mentioned, a participation component. So we're looking at all 11th and 12th grade students, plus any 9th and 10th grade students taking and passing accelerated courses. So that's our denominator. And then we look at all students that are participating in accelerated courses. That's our numerator. So we get a percentage of those students who are participating, and we assign 25 points to those students. And then there's the performance side of the acceleration component, looks at, of those students who participate, were they successful on those accelerated courses, AP, IB, ACE, dual credit, enrollment, industry certifications. And we assign up to 25 points based on the performance of those students on those accelerated courses to get our combined points across participation and performance. And then our college and career readiness indicator, as you will recall, recently added ACT work keys, but it's a two-look system, if you will. It looks at, did the student meet ACT benchmarks in English or reading, And did the student meet the ACT benchmark for math? As a half a point assigned to each of those subject areas on the ACT. Or did the student have an ACT WorkKeys Silver certification along with a career pathway or industry certification? Or did the student have a gold or platinum on the ACT WorkKeys? That's also equal to 1 point. So a max of 1 point per student in the college career readiness component based on whether they were successful on ACT or ACT WorkKeys. So once we have calculated all those weighted indicators, we get a total or a total score for the school and district, and then we are able to assign our summative rating A through F based on that total score. And these are the score cuts for each of those summative ratings separately for districts, 700-point schools and 1,000-point schools. We established those based, we have established those several years back. I know there were a couple of times we had to reestablish cuts for high schools because of the growth calculations changing from different assessments. But these cuts have been established for several years now and allow for schools and districts, the distribution of grade assignments for schools and districts to change from year to year. We don't reset cuts each year. We don't reestablish a specific bell curve, if you will. These standards are established, and we have had more schools and districts this past year that are a C or higher than we have in years prior. Just to touch a little further on graduation rates, we're in the middle of looking at graduation rates and presenting those to the board now. And I just want to point out that we use the federally defined 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate. So that looks at when the student first entered the 9th grade. That's when they are established in a cohort, or if they enter into a school or district after the 9th grade, they're assigned to a cohort based on when they would have been in the 9th grade. For accountability purposes, we only consider those students receiving a traditional high school diploma as a graduate, and that is the only status that contributes to the graduation rate. We also report out a dropout rate, which are any students that did not receive a traditional high school diploma or other completion status, such as a certificate of completion, a GED that's established, that is issued by the district. And then the other status is still enrolled. So a student who did not complete in 4 years, but is still enrolled as of September 1st of the following year. We did have the addition of the state-defined alternate diploma this year. Well, it was established for students entering in the 18-19 school year as a freshman. So this is the first year graduation rates will be calculated, including a cohort of students on the path to receive an alternate diploma. So this year we had 122 students that received an alternate diploma, and then we'll have students that may continue on beyond 4 years. If they're on the path to receive an alternate diploma, they can actually be removed from their initial cohort and put into a new established cohort each year until they either complete or they age out of the system. So they're continued to be counted as a traditional graduate when they graduate. So that's something new for this year. Okay, this is just an overview of the assessment accountability timelines. Of course, this is very broad. We work to try to make these things happen as timely as possible. As I mentioned, we're getting ready to do graduation rates. We either do them, we either take them to the board in January or February. It looks like this year we'll be getting them to the board in January. We have our spring assessment period, which is of course followed by our fall assessment period. This is where we gather the majority of the data that goes into the accountability system. We work in June and July to process that assessment data and any other accountability data that needs to be cleaned up. We put out assessment results in August, and then we take accountability results to the state board in September. This slide just kind of shows how we go about reviewing and improving and changing accountability. So this is the process that we work through. The Accountability Task Force is one of those steps. So as we receive public feedback, we take any of the feedback that we feel like the department feels like is something that is feasible, that can be included in the accountability system and still be in compliance with state and federal requirements. Bring those proposed changes or ideas to the Accountability Task Force to provide feedback and insights from your perspective on those changes. So we're looking to you as a stakeholder group to consider the things that we bring to you, and think about that not only at your district level, but in a broader perspective about how does this affect student outcomes in the state of Mississippi, and how does this help to improve education in Mississippi. And then we will take that feedback and vet it through our technical advisory committee, which is a group of experts from the fields of assessment and accountability that will help us to ensure that our processes are logical and standard and meet federal guidelines, expectations. And then once that is vetted through that group, we take any changes that the department would like to move forward to the Commission on School Accreditation. So that's the first policy-making body that will consider a change. And then if they approve, they can approve, deny, or change any of those recommendations. And then they can recommend those to the State Board of Education. And that's where it'll go to the State Board of Education for discussion. It'll go out for public comment. And then that ends up where policy becomes final. Okay, I've covered a lot of material at a high level, hopefully. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts about any of those? We still have a few minutes. And also, if you want me to go back to any of those slides, I could do that.
Alan, this is Alicia. To be clear, they're going to begin implementing the scholars who are on a certificate track, like IEP, that nature will be counted in under the alternate diploma. Is that what you were saying? Alternate route diploma for the counting of the cohort?
So those students who are on the track to receive a state-defined alternate diploma, those students, if they don't complete in 4 years, they can, let's say the student doesn't complete the end of this year, and I know we have a handful of students who didn't, they will be pulled from the current cohort.
Okay.
And then they'll be added back again next year if they complete, and they can be counted as a traditional graduate. So they're not limited to that 4-year completion requirement. They can complete in 5 years or 6 years until they age out of the system. So the end is either they complete prior to aging out or they age out.
And will this have a negative impact? Because I know the accountability has the 4 years in there. So with a student having to go through that route?
No. This would have a positive. This would have a positive. Yeah. So these students that they were not considered like a traditional graduate in the past. So now they will be. So
okay.
Yeah. It's a good thing.
Good. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hey, Dr. Burrow, I do.
with the EL component, will there be something in writing that discusses that if a student reaches an overall 4 sometime in their school career, even though they don't meet exit criteria, that they are not counted in the in count? That's very confusing for districts. Is there going to be some amendments to that or something in writing?
Yes, we every year that we go through a round of accountability or a run of the accountability system, we try to make any clarifications that come up in the business rules to try to help schools and districts. And we typically do have updates to the business rules on an annual basis. We'll go through a round of that, yes, in this through the spring, just to try to add any clarifications, anything that we can do to make the business rules clear. We will try to do that. We didn't have any of those changes to bring to you today, but we'll do that at some point, yes. And I can, I want to make sure everyone knows. Let me see if I can pull this up since we have just a little bit extra time. Bear with me just a second. Okay, hopefully you can see my web browser. And I just want to point out on this, the district and school performance website is in the directory. And you'll see there's an accountability task force link here that will post the meetings to presentations and minutes. But also make sure that I want to make sure that everybody knows where to get to the business rules for the accountability system. And under documents on the main web page, let me get back to the main web page, is accreditation accountability standards. And so this is the business rules where, this is the accreditation accountability standards where the business rules are located, and you'll see each year's versions on here. So when we have changes this year to incorporate those, will get added as a 2022 version. And sometimes when we discuss a topic in the task force, we will specifically refer to these business rules and bring them to you. But this is page 27 is where the business rules start for the statewide accountability system. And then it is not, it seems like it's long, but this document is long, but the business rules for the accountability system only go to page 45. So if you have the opportunity to read through those, that may be something that would be helpful to you also as a new member of the accountability task force. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint again. And if we don't have any more questions, then we can move on to our next topic. All right, so I'll start this off. We mentioned the ESEA amendment submission. This is something that is required by the federal department following our COVID amendment submission that was approved in August of 2022. And this addendum included any necessary temporary adjustments due to the disruptions from the COVID pandemic. As you will recall, there were some waivers of accountability, and then there was an expectation put out from the department that accountability will resume, with the understanding that there may be some needed adjustments. And most states submitted an addendum. Mississippi was fortunate that we didn't have quite the amount of disruption as many other states did, but we did have to make some adjustments, as some of you will recall, for growth in high schools, and that lagging data from the prior year during the pandemic, and how that impacted accountability measures, and then some adjustments for how we calculate school improvement designations, the exclusion of those years, those pandemic years, and then the adjustment of our long-term goals had to be moved up 2 years because of the pandemic. So the federal department approved our addendum with the expectation that we submit an amendment to include any permanent changes, such as those long-term goals. This also presents an opportunity for the department to include any other needed additions or clarifications to our consolidated state plan. The U.S. Department has mentioned a few times that states do make adjustments or changes that may be considered not substantial, that may not require an amendment, but there are some things that we want to update and clarify in language, and we will do that. One of those things that has already been mentioned is just some clarifications around how we consider an EL student to be proficient. And the EL Progress was a new addition to federal accountability requirements back when ESSA came out. And the department has worked through that component quite a bit. A lot of it has come through this task force over the past several years. So we'll make some clarifications to language around that. We'll also add in some language that will include our addition of the ACT work keys to our college and career readiness component. That is not in the consolidated state plan yet, so we will include that. And then there will be other program offices throughout the agency that will provide some clarifications and some updates around business rules and policies for their program offices. All of those, once we get all of those compiled, we will put the addendum out for public comment, and we'll notify all of y'all accordingly. And then we'll take that public comment and any adjustments or changes that need to be made, and then we'll present that to the State Board of Education and submit that addendum. So what we do want to discuss today is one of those pieces of the considerations in the addendum around exiting students from school improvement. And so I'm going to pass this topic off to Dr. Domaleski and Sandra Robertson to discuss in more detail as we consider those needed changes.
Thank you so much, Alan. As Alan mentioned in his remarks, and as you may be very familiar with, there's 3 federally required categories with ESSA, and that is CSI, TSI, and they call ATSI, or additional targeted support and improvement. What we want to talk about today is TSI. I should say a word about why TSI and not the other categories, and there's a short answer to that. CSI and ATSI are very prescriptive. The federal law is very clear about how those calculations have to happen and what gets you in and what gets you out. And in the case of ATSI, for example, that's the requirement that if any one group of students falls below the threshold for CSI, then they're marked as ATSI. And our analysis show that, looking at those identification criteria, we're not seeing evidence that that groups that are placed in ATSI are meeting those requirements to get out. And since those requirements are fairly prescriptive in the feds, there's not a lot of latitude to make adjustments there. But TSI is a little different, and that's why we want to talk with you about it today. And let me tee up kind of what the issue is and share with you an idea we have that we think is promising to address the issue. I want to be very clear that I work very collaboratively with colleagues at the MGE, Alan, Sonia, Deborah, to frame this today. So even though I'll take a first shot at it, I hope my colleagues will feel free to lean into conversations as we go. So targeted sports improvements, or TSI, is a requirement to annually identify any school in which at least one subgroup of students is consistently underperforming. Unlike the other categories that I noted, states have some flexibility in how to designate schools as long as those methods are based on all indicators in the system, at least when it comes to entry criteria. The requirements are not overly prescriptive from the feds. They just say you have to use all indicators. Mississippi has determined these entry criteria, which we think have worked well and we're not recommending changes to. The subgroup is in the lowest 50% of overall accountability index. It's in the lowest quartile of the 3-year average gap to goal, and that group scores in the lowest quartile of the 3-year improvement towards gap to goal closure. So what we're really talking about is a group that is lower performing compared to that group's performance in the state and has one of the largest gaps to the goal. That's what designates a group as a TSI group and gets that school designation as TSI. Next slide, please. But what we hope to focus on today is, well, that's what gets you in. What gets you out? What are the exit criteria for TSI status? And the first is when a group no longer meets those criteria. Another way to say that is when they satisfy those criteria such that in another pass of data or another year of data, they would not be identified as TSI. The other criterion, and go ahead and kind of hit the main point here, this is the one that we've discovered in our analysis is really the highest bar, is those groups need to demonstrate that a 3-year average growth exceeds target proficiency growth rate projected for the same statewide group. So it's kind of dense language. Let me try to break it down for you a little bit. So you see two tables that I've just grabbed a screenshot of here. The top table shows, it's actually just a part of the table, shows what the baseline, interim, and long-term goals for a group are. And then that gets even more granularly defined as specific annual requirements for growth for that group in order to be on that trajectory. So for example, and I'll show you some data here in just a moment, students with disabilities, which are overwhelmingly the group that is flagged for TSI, we would need to see a 6.79 percentage point increase annually in proficiency rates for ELA and 6.77 percentage point increase annually in mathematics to be on that trajectory. And maybe as you hear me describe that, what may occur to you, it certainly did to me, is that changes in proficiency really aren't exactly the same thing as growth. Those are, I think, more accurately described as trend or improvement over time, again, based on proficiency rate. But again, so the exit criteria are you satisfy the entry criteria and you're demonstrating gains in proficiency that are on track with these targets that I just described. Next slide, please. Actually go to the next slide, if you would, then I'm going to go backwards again. Why are we talking about this now? Well, we want to make sure, as I mentioned early in the meeting, we want to try to really ground our conversations in principles. And one principle that we want to acknowledge straight away is that exit criteria should be ambitious but attainable. So we never want to apologize for saying we have high standards in Mississippi. and that's absolutely principled and appropriate. But at the same time, we want to be we want to see some evidence that those standards are reasonable and attainable, and that schools that apply the right interventions can meet those targets. At the same time, we want to avoid what I'm calling colloquially a swinging door with school designations. We want schools that exit to show demonstrated improvement, to be sure, and we don't want them to be quickly reclassified. So swinging door, or bounce, or anything in words like that. We don't want to see, 1 year you're in, 1 year you're out, 1 year you're in, 1 year you're out. That's not a good way to approach school improvement. And so we want to make sure that we have confidence that the group is performing at a higher level and is on the right track. And also, as we approach this conversation, we want to avoid unnecessary disruption to the system. Now, we'll disrupt it when we need to, how we need to, but again, if it's unnecessary, we want to try to minimize that through our decision making. So all things being equally, we value solutions that are coherent and consistent. Veteran members of this group will have heard me say before, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. So we have to be, I think, modest in how we approach our decisions when it comes to the accountability model. So we're trying to solve for making this more attainable, but at the same time minimizing disruption and having more assurance that our decisions are actually pegged to credible improvement rates. So now if we can go backwards, my fault for not really ordering these well. But so we took a look at the data as we were exploring this together before the meeting, and we asked ourselves, well, what did we see in the most recent accountability data regarding TSI identification and exit? So we found 50 schools with TSI designations that are potentially eligible to exit in 2022. And to make my point really explicit here, 49 of those 50 schools were identified for that students with disabilities group. One school is identified for the Black African American group. So it's overwhelmingly the SWD group that we're seeing lead to that TSI designation. That breaks down into 40 schools identified for ELA and 42 for math. And the reason the sum is much greater than 50 is because there's a lot of overlap. You see some schools identified for both ELA and math. But you see in ELA, of those 40 schools identified, only one school exited. 39 schools then failed to exit. And of those 39, 38 failed to meet the growth criteria. So, and I put growth in quotes because of the sort of description I gave you before, that it's not really growth, it's more like improvement or trends and proficiency rates. So we see that often schools will meet the entry criteria, but won't meet that growth criteria. So it causes us to wonder if this is an attainable target. Mathematics is not quite as extraordinary, but the pattern still holds in a very demonstrable way. We saw 9 schools of those 42 exit. So obviously 33 would have failed to exit. And of those 33, fully 32 failed to meet the growth criteria. So that's what's holding them back. So let's skip 2 slides forward, please. So what's, we wanted to bring this group an idea, or at least I'll call it a framework or a sketch of an idea that we think is a promising solution, and get your advice and feedback on that. Our idea is to replace that second exit criterion, which is currently, as I mentioned, framed as growth and subgroup proficiency or improvement, with, I'll call it actual growth as defined in the accountability system. As Alan described in his opening remarks, there is a real growth calculation that's produced through the accountability system, and that's operationalized through the transition table approach, which is very widely used, technically defensible method that many states, in addition to Mississippi, use. We think this is a more consistent and probably credible definition of growth. It's coherent with the principles of the state system. It rewards progress for cohorts of students over time, and we think it's better suited compared to proficiency rates to detect changes across the performance continuum. Stated another way, it's more sensitive to change. And that should be reasonable because we're not just looking at a threshold change across proficiency. We're looking at change in any one of those markers in the transition table. And by keeping the first criterion, remember the first criterion is you have to satisfy what got you in to get out. Then we think we're helping to ensure that we're not exiting schools that are among the lowest performing. So we already have evidence that they've moved up in terms of overall proficiency rates such that they wouldn't be designated again. And the second part says, are you growing? Are you moving in the right direction? Would be part of the definition that we wanted to vet with the group today. Next slide. So we took some look at the data here, and we looked at those schools that were that failed to exit based on the second criterion. So for the case of mathematics, that's the table on the left. We're looking at 31 schools for ELA growth on the right panel. We're looking at 38. And this is just a histogram of the growth rates from the accountability. This is what the students with disability group, almost exclusively, with exceptions as noted, achieved with respect to growth in the accountability system. So if it's answering the question, if we think growth is a good criterion as that second step, how much growth should we expect? And we thought, well, let's start with, well, how much growth do we observe? In the case of mathematics, you see the mean growth is a little over 50. So you can read the tiny print in the upper right there. It's 52.02. And for ELA, it's a little lower. It's 39.5, so about 40. And then the numbers you see at the bottom of the histograms here are the quartiles. And that's just to give you a sense for the spread of the data. A quick little refresher on what a quartile is. The Q1 is the point that separates the lowest 25% from the highest 75%. Q2 is the median, or that place that separates the bottom 50 from the top 50. And Q3, as you would expect, is the place, the marker of the distribution that separates the top 25% from the bottom 75%. So we see in each case that it's a little over 50 is the average or median growth that we're seeing in mathematics, and 39 to 40 is average or median for what we're seeing in language arts, English language arts. If you took it to like the upper 25%, then you're approaching 60 for mathematics and 49 for ELA. And another way to think about it, because a lot of times I think the numbers tend to just lose meaning. You just say, all I know is that 50 is larger than 40. What does 50 mean? 50 describes a school in which, and I'm taking a little bit of liberties for the sake of simplicity, but a school could get a 50, or in this case, a group could get a 50 if half of their students are showing transition from one level to another. Because remember, you get like a point in many cases if you move from one level to another, or if you maintain proficiency level. There are some transitions. I don't know if I remember it as well as Alan does off the fly, but I think if you move like if you move 2 levels, Alan, or if you get up to advanced, then you get 1.25. So I see you nodding. So yeah, there are some occasions where you can get a little bit more than a point. But as a general rule of thumb, if a group is getting a growth score of 50, then at least half of your students are growing, and they're moving in the right direction. And that might be might help us both define in terms of what we're seeing in the data, and what it means in terms of what's actually happening with that student progression. Helps us get our head around what it might mean to look at a criterion such as that. So I'm almost done here, and then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. Next slide, please. Again, just to help prime the pump a little bit for discussion, we're not trying to overly sell anything. We just want to equip you with good information. If the second criterion were changed to be a 50 or higher, so an actual growth score of 50 or higher, then we would see 8 schools would meet the exit criterion for ELA and 17 would meet it for mathematics. And as I just noted, that value represents on average half the students demonstrating progress. So obviously it wouldn't create a situation where we're just seeing, everybody exit out of TSI, but it would be a much more attainable target for many schools. And it might help us address the issue of ensuring that those that remain in TSI truly are the ones most urgently in need of support and are where those school improvement resources are best directed. Next slide. So that's our framing. And the question we have for the task force this afternoon, and we're happy to answer obviously any clarifying questions you have, but principally, do you think using growth as defined through the transition table in the accountability system as an exit criterion is a promising strategy? If you think so, do you have recommendations for where that threshold should be? We've sort of put a placeholder at 50. We think that that's a pretty good place to focus. But again, there's some judgment here, which is why we want to get the advice of a group of experts such as we have assembled here. Another question that we asked ourselves as we were discussing this internally is, should it be a multi-year growth, such as an average over 2 or 3 years, or should it be the most recent year growth? We can see advantages or disadvantages to each. An advantage to having a multi-year growth would be more stability. There's more credibility that that's a signal that the school's moving in the right direction. But the other side of the coin is that TSI is an annual decision, and using annual data may be preferred. And there may be other considerations that we haven't spoken to that you want to bring to the table. So I'm going to pause here. Let me just see if Sonia or Deborah or Alan have anything they want to add to my framing remarks before we open it up to the task force for your advice and discussion. Okay, hearing none, and again, just recognizing my colleagues, we did work on this collaboratively. Let's open it up. If you want to raise your hand or just take yourself off mute, we're happy to receive your feedback however you'd like to share it. I know I've given you
Hi,
a list.
Chris.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, this is Bradley Robertson, Superintendent of Oxford. I am certainly in favor of using growth as the TSI second TSI exit criteria. When you put up the slide that said and underlined obtainable, honestly, we have had that exact conversation in our district in trying to rack our brains of how we could possibly meet the second criteria as it stands now. As we all know, a lot of those special education students, getting them to proficiency to change that metric is incredibly difficult to do, especially when you have a very high functioning part of your population as well. So I certainly think this is a step in the right direction. We put growth at the forefront of our model already in accountability. I think this just adds another very important metric to making sure that we're focusing on our students that struggle the most.
Thank you for your feedback. It's very helpful.
And I would say, Chris, as far as your second question, the growth threshold, I certainly think, since the mean and median are so close in this instance, I would certainly go with the mean or median for both math and ELA.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your feedback.
Hey, Chris, this is Christy. Is there a way you can share the slides with us? I kind of want to walk through as you're doing it, and I don't want you to have to go through it on the presentation, but I'm still really trying to understand the difference in the two methods that are being proposed and which schools were looked at, which of them met the initial criteria, and are we only looking at those that did meet the first criteria but then didn't meet the second one? Are we looking at all of the schools? Just some questions about if the schools are exited based on this new criteria that we're setting. Did you look to see how many if you applied it based on prior data, would be re-identified as TSI the following year, just because we didn't set that threshold high enough to keep them out of it. So just want to walk through your slides again kind of quickly on my own to see if I am making sense of my questions.
Yeah, I'm right. All great questions. Alan, is there a way to drop the slides in the chat? And maybe you've already done it. I didn't see it.
Well, I emailed it to her, but I'll see if I can do that as well.
This is Alicia, Lawrence County School District. I think something that we should consider, because we're getting ready to deal with that, is if there is a drastic change in enrollment, an influx of the subgroups, or an exit and exit of the subgroups, as well as any of those schools merge, because we're getting ready to do a merger here, and part of it would be from a school that is a TSI school. So sometimes things like that happen, and so I guess the wording of who will still be considered if there were other underlying things that may occur need to be considered in there.
Thanks for that. And I don't know, Deb or others, if you have any quick response to what happens when schools merge and how that's handled. It probably a lot of dominoes probably topple in the system, but if not, I'll take a bit of that and we can get back to it. Mm-hmm.
So Chris, very shortly, and that's typically when districts notify the Office of Accreditation that they're about to merge or reconfigure their schools. Our Office of Accreditation does send a list of things that those districts should consider, and things that they need to look at. And one of those things is how it might impact school improvement identifications if they have identified schools. We have an internal review group that meets annually once we get the reconfiguration information and all of that, as well as data from the current year's accountability, to make some determinations about if a designation will stand or follow a certain group of kids. So there's a process that we have internally to look at that. And if you want to reach out to me, if you all haven't reached out to the Office of Accreditation yet to inform them or let them know that you're thinking about that or about to do that, I would encourage you first to do that, and then they'll give you all of the things that you need to consider and who you need to contact.
Thank you, Sonia.
So Chris, I kind of have a question. I want to apologize early. I am that one that asks a lot of questions for clarity purposes.
Please don't apologize. We like that.
So initially, I'm excited to see the growth component used for TSI, because that is the forefront of our thinking. We're trying to go all of our students towards proficiency. So my question would be the growth threshold, if we're setting it at 50, that is just initially saying within those subgroups that we're expecting 50% of those students within the subgroup should have grown. That is correct, right?
That's correct.
Whatever that threshold is. And then my other question would be, I guess for me, I'm in favor of an over 2 year, but only if, I guess, let me ask this question before I say that, the exiting, that would be considered this 2022 data. And, we've been out for, had the COVID, and we saw a lot of growth with districts. So that would be a lot of us. And we kind of say that our district is kind of a level setting, if that makes sense. So that would be a lot of growth there with them being able to exit, but then maybe coming back in. That's not the case. We hope not, but just thinking holistically, them being able to come back in. So I guess I am in favor of an over 2 multi-year growth to ensure sustainable.
Yeah, no, those are very, very astute observations. I agree, because we do know that there can be spikes and dips in performance, both related to COVID disruptions or just related to who's in the group. So you make a persuasive point about multi-year averages, helping to settle down those spikes and dips. And like I said, there's not a single right technical answer here. And well, on the other side of the coin, we know that some schools will say we want to be able to have a decision made on 1 year of data since it is an annual determination. So yeah, I think you rightly put your finger on an important issue. And if we do use multi-year, that I don't have data to share with you at this meeting on that, but my expectation would be that it would, it's not a certainty, but my expectation is that it would probably raise the bar for exit a little bit more than what we showed you today, which I think is your intuition as well. Christy, I wanted to get to some of your questions. You asked a number of questions along the way when you were thinking about this. One, a few of them I wrote down. I can come back to. The data we showed you were just for schools that failed to exit on the second criterion. So that's 38 for language arts. It's 31 for math. The reason it's not 32 is because I think there was one that didn't have an M size for that. But that was just this. It's a pretty small sample, and it's just based on the 1 year. So it is very hard for us to speculate about what would happen in future years with this rule. And again, we're putting a lot of confidence in the fact that the entry criterion are related to proficiency and are suited to ensure that schools that aren't among the lowest in proficiency are in that group. So you have to increase proficiency just to meet the entry criterion. It's sort of a given. So adding that as an additional criterion, we think just kind of doubles down on the same thing. Now, and again, I know it'll be obvious to you in case it's not obvious to everybody else. What it actually does is it rewards progress that may be in the region that approaches but doesn't cross proficiency. So you can have a group where we see some progress that goes from 1B to 2A or something like that. That doesn't quite cross proficiency, but it shows those students are moving in the right direction.
Hey, this is Ryan. So I wanted to say, number one, I do echo the comments that this is a good direction. Honestly, the wording that we had in there anyway, using growth, it was very confusing. Trying to explain this to people at the school level has been very complicated. But it's a good data common sense measure anyway. One clarification question that I have, I think I know, but I just want to be sure. So what we're saying here is we're saying growth points based on the rules. Some people have said growth percentages, which that's a little different. So I just want to be sure that we are saying this would be the growth points based on the rules for the identified subgroup. Is that correct?
100% correct.
Okay. So with that, we're a microcosm of the state. I pulled up our IEP growth from the last 3 cycles that we have data. And it looks like to me, honestly, that 50 threshold that we're looking at is a good mark. Generally speaking, we're just a microcosm of the state with all of that. So to me, it looked like a fair measure, kind of like you're saying, attainable, which I agree with that. So currently, to be honest with you, I like current year because you're right, TSI is annual, whereas ATSI, we think of 3-year average, of course. And I like current year with it. I think it makes sense. It gives a new principal a chance, if you will. They're not, dealing with data from the past and so on. So I currently like current year, and I think this is a good direction and a good proposal. And that's kind of where I stand right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Very helpful. I appreciate that. So I've heard, so we've heard some clarifying questions, people that have asked really astute questions to help understand implications in the near and longer term. And I'm acknowledging that the data we have here are limited in our ability to anticipate the full range of considerations. But based on the principles that we've talked about and the data we have been able to share, it sounds like there's agreement that using growth is a principally good idea. I've heard a few voices say that 50 feels like an attractive criterion. There's maybe not full unanimity, but it does seem to be some, the majority of the comments I've heard so far have been that annual growth would be preferred over multi-year growth. But so that's just really a reflection back to the group that I'm hearing your input accurately.
Chris, there were a couple of comments in the chat. I don't know if you had seen those.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to look at them now. Okay, so there's another voice in support of using growth with the suggestion that multi-year may be preferred. Another support for growth. Yeah, very, very. Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry that I'll mumble through this question a little bit, but because we're moving towards growth rather than just movement towards proficiency, are we going to have any concerns with having enough data to be able to make those growth determinations? And I'm thinking about elementary schools or K-3 centers that now may have been identified for TSI but won't have growth. So they're not going to be able to demonstrate exit, or sizes are too small. You had 12, but you don't have at least 10 for growth. So I'm just trying to figure out if there's any drawbacks of using growth and having to make lots of extra additional rules because of N size or not having all the data that we need. And then how does this play if we use essentially a 1-year exit, but a 3-year entrance requirement on averaging?
Yeah, on the first question, and Deborah, I may, or Sonia, whomever feels equipped, I may ask for your help with this. I think my intuition is, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that if we have the data to make a TSI entry decision, it's very common that we also have the data to make an exit decision, even if we add growth. I think from the data that I saw, there were only 1 or 2 cases where you didn't meet the M size on growth, but you did otherwise. Let me pause there and see. Deborah or others, do you have a reflection on that?
Yeah, that's correct. For the first part of TSI identification is whether their overall subgroup accountability score was in the bottom 50%. So that means that they had to have enough students in every category, even the low 25, which gets down to even smaller groups of students. So typically these schools will be meeting that in size.
Yeah, and Christy, while acknowledging your question is very fair and appropriate, I don't know the answer to the second part, which is like I honestly feel neutral on whether or not a multi-year versus a single-year approach is preferred. Yeah, I do feel a multi-year approach it will give us a little more stability, guard against there being like a 1-year spike. But as Ryan and others gave voice to, I can see some advantages to saying that given that the entry criteria have to be met, that growth piece could be rolled back to a 1 year. And it's more of an extra assurance that the proficiency is accompanied by a credible measure of growth in that year. But this is very much a policy decision, not a technical decision. So I don't have I've no interest in trying to persuade your your thinking about that. Yeah, it's something that you could truly take a reasonable point of view on either side.
Let me ask you this. Would it be possible at some point for you to put like 2 examples for us to see how it would affect over just create a school and just how it would affect over multiple years, if it were 2 years or just 1 year? Is there any way we might see an example? I just needed to see an example, I think.
I think we can. We can't on the fly during this meeting, but that's something we can follow up on. So I'll note that as an area of follow up.
Perfect. Yeah, I wouldn't want you to have to do it right now, but just in the future, kind of send it to us and let us peruse it.
Yeah, I think the challenge here, so help me out, Alan and colleagues, we need to get this amendment shaped up for a February 1 submission, right? Let me pause there and say, is that the intention?
Well, yes, the U.S. Department has recommended a February 1st deadline for these submissions in order to get them back in time for this year's accountability run. That doesn't mean that that's a hard deadline, but we were hoping to get something to them in February.
Right. So if that's the case, and yeah, Alan, you characterize that accurately, of course. It's desirable to meet that deadline because it gives us more assurance that we're likely to get a speedy response from the feds. And by the way, speedy when it comes to federal responses, take that with a lot of liberty. But it's not a hard and fast rule. So I think we could do a couple of things as a task force now. We could say that this is important enough that we want to bring this back to the February meeting, which will delay the process a little bit. Or the task force can say, we principally agree with using growth. We will, not get into the details of making a recommendation about 1 year versus multi-year. We'll just keep our recommendation at the place where we want MDE and its technical advisors to take a look at that before they complete that business rule. Or you can say, based on the evidence we have now, we want to make a hard and fast recommendation. So if you're kind of looking to guidance from the task force about how strong you want to be in this now, and I do think one option can be that you can decide to just recommend that the department take a look at that and make a decision based on their judgment of the findings, or you may insist that it come back to a future meeting.
For me, the current year versus multi-year wouldn't be a deal breaker. It's better, either way, it's better than using the 3-year average proficiency that we currently do with those annual expectations. So that wouldn't be any sort of deal breaker at all. So your recommendation, Dr. Domaleski, I would be fine with using the growth points, but for the identified subgroup, the threshold of 50, I don't know if we're talking about doing a hard set on that as a group or not, but maybe we could, and then letting the TAC look at, the annual year versus a 2-year or 3-year average. I currently am for the current year, like I said, and I think that makes sense since we're talking TSI, not ATSI. However, that would be a deal breaker for me personally.
Okay. So if that is something that others can agree with. Where we might leave it is to say that the decision of the task force is that using growth is an agreeable strategy. The decision about the exact criterion, whether it's 1 year or multi-year, is not something that the task force is going to make a specific recommendation. That can happen through additional analysis and inquiry with the department between now and preparation of the amendment, which again, there's some reasons why we want to try to get that February 1st if we can. And then we'll just report back at a future meeting kind of what the decision was and how it aligns to the principles. Presumably, every principle still applies, that needs to be attainable, and it needs to minimize the likelihood of repeated entry and exit into the category. Is there anybody that objects to that? Okay, well, I think we have our marching orders then. We're going to pursue a growth solution. We're, as we noted, and as I think some voices supported, we're going to focus on 50 as the criterion. But we'll make a final decision about that criterion and about single versus multi-year based on some additional analyses. Thank you. I'm seeing the chat. Thank you. And we will report back about the amendment that was submitted and the findings of that analysis. We can always take it up in future years if we feel additional tweaks are in order. That was productive, colleagues. Thank you very much. We're a little ahead of schedule, so that's a good thing. Why don't we go ahead and take our break, if that's okay? It's 2:38. Why don't we just call that 2:40 and come back at 5 minutes before 3? Okay. Let's adjourn until 2:55.
Chris, I'm not sure if you were speaking to us. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Deborah. Hey, everybody, welcome back. It's 2:55, so it's time to get started. I believe we're ready to transition to our next topic. And I was just saying, I believe Wendy's going to guide us through this. I see her name here. So Wendy, I'd love to pass the baton to you and have you lead us through this topic.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all's time. Alan, if you'll advance to the next slide. I wanted to just talk with you a little bit today about State Board of Education approved industry certifications as it relates to the acceleration component of the accountability model. In the business rules, of course, it states that the acceleration component refers to percentages of students taking and passing assessments associated with advanced placement, IB, Cambridge, dual credit, or it reads State Board of Education approved industry certification courses. And then it goes on to say, for industry certification courses, the student must pass the exam, the corresponding recognized industry certification that goes along with whatever program that student is enrolled in. So the next slide, Alan. Thank you. So back in October of 2021, Dr. Brown, who was state CT director at the time, went to the State Board of Education and requested their approval on a list of State Board of Education industry certifications. And although this is difficult to see, this is the list. So on the left-hand column, it provides the cluster, and then it provides the program of study. It provides the industry certification. And then in the very last column, you see yes for all of those because those have been approved by the State Board of Education. All right, next slide. So the way that we administer the State Board of Education approved industry certifications is we have an assessment contract with the Research and Curriculum Unit at Mississippi State University. They used to, those of you who've been in CTE for a while, they used to develop and implement the CPAS exam, which is now sunsetted into what we have is our industry certifications. So basically the RCU procures annually a number of vouchers. Those vouchers are used to administer the State Board of Education industry certifications to our students who are in those respective programs. Each year, the RCU shares with MDE the data file that is used to calculate these industry certifications for each district as part of the acceleration component that I talked about in my first slide. So in theory, if a student actually acquires a State Board of Education industry certification outside of the agreement with RCU, the certification is not currently counted in acceleration. So let me give you an example. In the area of construction, we administer the NCCER exam that correlates with that program. Currently, we, in our agreement with the RCU, we will procure 2 vouchers for each student to take the NCCER. After that point in time, we don't administer the NCCER to those students again. They have those 2 vouchers. We were approached at the very beginning of the year about a student being able to take that assessment, that industry certification exam, more than twice. What if we want that student to take that exam a 3rd time? Can we do that? And the response was, yes, you can do that. We at the MDE, we are procuring that opportunity for every student to take that exam twice. And so that was the response. In response to that, the question was, well, will it count toward accountability? Well, as it says here in the last bullet, currently it won't count toward a district's accountability, because if it's taken outside of that agreement with the research and curriculum unit, we don't have the data or the evidence of that student earning that industry certification. So that was the question that was asked of me. Well, how then can we make it part of? So if you will advance, Alan, for me. So for your consideration today, I brought this to Alan and Dr. Domaleski, as well as Dr. Vanderford. If a district chooses to test a student additionally, which means outside of that RCU contract, on really any of these State Board of Education industry certifications, should the MDE allow the district an opportunity to self-report that achievement for acceleration for the sake of the accountability model, similar to the way that we allow districts to self-report the ACT as well as the ACT work keys? And so in talking with the internal team, along with Dr. Domaleski, it was decided that we would bring it to you guys this afternoon for consideration. So I hope that I have set the groundwork a little bit and some background and an explanation as to what we are considering here. And the next slide, Alan, I think this is my last slide. Just thinking in terms as you begin to consider this and discuss it, maybe some pros and cons with the self-reporting of these industry certifications. Obviously, the pro is districts would have the ability to include more assessment attempts in the accountability measures. But as we talk internally, some of the cons that kind of came up were that the MDE verification of the district reporting data has been of concern, not only with this recommendation, but it has come up as a concern even with ACT as well as the ACT work keys. Equitable access to additional attempts on the industry certification exams, and the implications on accountability. If we get into allowing multiple attempts that count toward accountability, will there at some point be inequitable access to those additional attempts? Does it lend itself to a system of the haves and the have-nots? So that's another concern, possibly. And then how do we treat unsuccessful attempts?
Yeah, Wendy,
Again,
I kind of
go
added
ahead,
that one
Alan.
in.
Thank you.
So as you may know, or some of you will know, we measure every industry certification course attempt, and that counts in your participation and your performance metric for acceleration. So if we allow districts to self-report, how do we ensure that the district is reporting both a successful and unsuccessful additional attempt for an industry certification exam?
Okay. Thank you for that, Alan. So that, again, if you want to go back, well, you can leave it here so as they consider and discuss. But that is what I'm here to discuss with you this afternoon, and have you consider. So if you have anything that you would like to throw out there, certainly do so. I'm here to answer any questions that you have, and I will turn it back over to our fearless leader, Dr. Domaleski.
Brilliant job teeing this up, Wendy. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your attention to trying to help the task force see what some of the advantages and disadvantages are. Again, we're just being, our interest is to be as candid as possible with the team. We didn't, if we thought it was a layup, that it was just an easy decision, we wouldn't have brought it. There's no easy questions that get brought to the task force. Only the ones that require really careful judgment and consideration. So let's open it up for your questions and input.
Dr. Burrow, this is Bradley from Oxford. This kind of somewhat reminds me of the issue we had with dual enrollment, dual credit courses a few years back when, if I remember correctly, it was just, wide open with dual enrollment, dual credit as far as going towards acceleration. And then you had, for example, university towns like myself in Oxford, where we had kids taking dual enrollment, dual credit courses, a ton of kids. And then you guys came to an agreement of this certain list of courses that we applied towards the accountability model, just to make sure that there was equitable access to all of those courses across the state. So this kind of reminds me of that, with getting to certifications that are outside of the agreement. I don't know, it may not be on the scope of the issue of dual enrollment, dual credit, but am I right about that? Am I thinking of that right?
If I could add to Mr. Bradley, I'm in agreement with you on that. This is Lawrence Hudson, Superintendent of Western Line School District, because there was also another piece to that acceleration in the dual credit and the reporting, where not only was the number of courses, it was just wide open and that was limited. The other thing was the reporting mechanisms also, because districts had different grading scales and districts, what was an ALB in my district may have been different. And so now, if I'm correct, Mr. Burrow, you all pull the information straight from the colleges and universities that were offering these courses and taking the grades straight from them. So it was two pieces to that dual enrollment and dual credit that was limited. If you can kind of catch us up on those, Mr. Burrow.
Well, right. There were, some efforts to try to better standardize our measures of performance for dual enrollment courses because of those two things. The quality of the course. So we looked at ensuring that these courses will translate into credits at colleges and universities within the state, and then also ensuring that the performance measure, those grade assignments, are consistent across schools and districts. As you mentioned, some districts weight those courses, those course grades, and we require that the grade be consistent with the grade assignment of the post-secondary institution that is entered in MSIS at the district level. So those are some changes that we made to try to tame in some of that with dual credit courses. And I think what the line that we're going down here is just to consider, that making this sort of change kind of opens the door for additional complications and less control of the data that we get, and the standardization of those performance measures and acceleration.
Let me, Alan, I want to just piggyback off that just quickly. To me, this is more akin to the ACT assessment, the WorkKeys assessment. We will continue to have a single list of State Board of Education industry certifications. So I say that to say it's not like we are saying all industry certifications, be it the OSHA 10 or whatever, we would still comply with that list that is State Board of Education approved that we look at annually. Those would be the only industry certifications that we would accept, because again, the business rule does provide for State Board of Education industry certifications. And so how those industry certifications typically work is the student is assessed, and if they pass that assessment or show proficiency or whatever that cut point is on that assessment, they receive an industry certification that they can then take into the workforce and show that they've shown proficiency in that particular program area, be it whatever the program area may be it architecture, be it like I mentioned earlier, construction education. So I don't think it would. I think that list of industry certifications would still be articulated as this is the list that districts would receive points in the acceleration component for.
And that's
So
what
Dr.
my
Clement,
question was. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, then what is the, what was it about it being outside the agreement with the RCU? I guess that's the part I'm not understanding. I may have been confused.
The initial question, and that's a good clarifying question. The initial question I received earlier this school year was actually from a superintendent who was concerned that in that RCU agreement, we do limit the number of times that a student can take an exam. And again, I use the NCCER. In our agreement with the RCU and the money that we provide them to procure vouchers, they procure with the NCCER, they procure 2 vouchers per student enrolled in the program eligible for an industry certification. So beyond that, however, if that district superintendent decided that they had a student or students that they wanted to offer a 3rd or 4th attempt, and they acquired that certification within those attempts, that would be outside of the data that we receive through our agreement with the RCU, thereby not counting in the acceleration component. So the initial question was, can we assess students as many times as we want? Well, certainly, you as a district, you can make that decision and should make it based on the student, and the student, if the student is on the cusp of passing, that might be a consideration for a 3rd attempt. Then the question came back up, well, why then does it not count toward accountability? Well, one of the issues we have is we have to know how many vouchers to procure annually. And the way that the voucher system works with industry certifications is they expire. They used to not expire. We used to be able to bank them. But when we procure those vouchers, they have an expiration date. And so, again, even if we wanted to give unlimited testing opportunities, it would be hard for us to know student by student what that might look like. And so that is the reason for the question posed to you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Clemens. I misunderstood. I was thinking you were saying it wasn't on the list. You're just talking about the number. You were talking about the number of attempts. I got you.
That's correct. Yes.
I do see how it could become maybe an issue. I think, as you stated before, with the have and the have-nots. But then I'm not only looking at it as money, but I also look at it as size of programs, because you may have districts who have very affluent programs that have hundreds of students in those programs, where you have a smaller district. I also was a little confused. I thought we were talking about industries certification that were not on the list, but I'm glad you clarified that.
Right.
My personal opinion, being a former CTE director, is potentially putting a cap on the number of attempts of testing, just so you don't fall into that, I guess, the point making system that some do with the accreditation or accountability model. But I do see where if you have a student who that is their career choice, kind of stopping them at 2, and maybe you may not have the funds. I see both sides of that, but I do agree. I think somebody in the chat said maybe placing a cap on the number of attempts at that time. So
I wanted to jump in if I may. What's the difference in this component and the students when taking the ACT? I feel like as long as there is the reporting, the test is secured, the reporting is accurate and good. I mean, just like I say, just like ACT, we know it's secured. We know that the reporting is accurate, and we don't put a limit that the kids start taking it maybe sophomore, junior year. And Mr. Bird, if I'm correct, it doesn't count into the snapshot or an accountability model until their senior year, and those kids can take that ACT as many times as they want, and the highest scores, if I'm correct, is utilized. So as long as the test is secure, as long as the reporting is secure, I don't see why a cap should be placed there, because I see similarities in how we utilize the ACT on the college and career readiness component, if I'm correct.
Yeah, the only difference really is that with acceleration, we measure each attempt, and it can be, it's not just their senior year. Whereas college and career readiness, the ACT, it is one look, and it's at the end of their senior year, and it's whatever their best score was across multiple attempts.
This is Stephen Hampton, Lamar County School Superintendent. I'm a former CTE director, and I would like to make the distinction. I will say this: I think it's really talking about peanuts, because we're only talking about the performance side of the acceleration, and so it's not going. And you're talking about a small number of students in each district. We got 10,300 students, and we got a small number that participate in the CTE. Relatively speaking to our overall population. But there is a difference between these industry certifications and the ACT. The industry certification is tied directly to a curriculum that is being taught sometimes for 2 years. And so you're really talking a norm reference test, ACT, versus a criterion reference test with the industry certifications. I just wanted to point that out. I don't want to make a big argument over it. It's okay with me one way or the other. But I do think if the multiple times you get into a situation where teachers could be using it as the test preparation instead of using it to prepare them for that test. And if they're preparing them for that curriculum throughout that program, they should be able to sit for that test 1 or 2 times and be able to pass it. That's just my take. Sorry.
Don't be sorry. We appreciate your input.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, so, I have 2 thoughts, and they're on opposite ends. So I make a offhand recommendation, or not a recommendation, but I have maybe a possible solution. The state is headed towards this, and we need to be headed towards this, like encouraging this and rewarding this and these types of things. And so on that one hand, you don't want to do anything that a student who gets an industry certification, no matter what, get rewarded for that. So that's my one thought. However, acceleration and college and career readiness are totally measured 2 different ways, as Alan just pointed out. And if you're going to self-report in acceleration, which is a current year thing only, as he pointed out too, and you're punished for failed tests in acceleration. In college and career readiness, you're not. So this isn't a recommendation, but it's a thought. Industry certification, what is that? Well, that's a career. It's in the genre of a career. What if, this is a little bit more of a major change, but what if we moved industry certification out of acceleration and you made it a third option in CCR. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that, but that, and I agree with what Steven just said too. That's not apples to apples. You're putting something in there that's not apples to apples in that component, but it's measured. It would allow you to do this where a failed test is not punishable in that category, point wise, what I mean, like it is in acceleration. So that's just one thought that comes up on how to do it. I don't think we can put it under acceleration self-reporting as is. I think that's a Pandora's box, and it just doesn't go there. It's just not, I don't know how that's going to work. Maybe college and career readiness, just thought.
Ryan, thanks, and others, thank you. And one thing that, let me see if I can get some clarity on myself, and I don't know if Wendy or Alan, you can help me with this. When an LEA or when a student attempts beyond the ones that the state funds or supports, what do we know, or what does that raise about sort of the fidelity of administration and reporting? Are there some uncertainties that are raised under those circumstances?
That is excellent question. With our state testing, the districts, have to submit district test security plans and local school test security plans. And, with ACT, I know that there are pretty stringent rules about the administration of those assessments, less so with the ACT work keys. I have found that to be the case. And I would argue less so with recognized industry certifications. The rules that are set for those other assessments seem to be far more stringent than those that have been set for the recognized industry certification. So that is a valid point to make, where as a state, we may not have as much, for lack of a better word, control over or verification of the administering of these assessments.
Thanks for that. And I'm not putting my finger on the scale, colleagues, but I'm just sort of recognizing that, there is a point of view that not everything that is worthwhile to pursue for individual enrichment of a student necessarily needs to be rolled into the consequential ESSA accountability model. So, it would be, I think, a defensible posture to say the state supports 2 attempts. Those we have mechanisms to include in acceleration. If there are additional attempts that students want to pursue, we want to encourage that and we want to applaud that, particularly if it helps a student meet his or her career ambitions. But if the risks of rolling that into the system outweigh the potential rewards, then that's something that we ought to take very seriously. An example of that is, and I know Alan and his colleagues know about this well, the federal government audits the state accountability system. And if the state is in a situation where it can't provide strong assurances of fidelity of administration and so forth, then that could be a risk that if we don't have a mitigation strategy for, then we need to be upfront with it. Others have pointed out drawbacks of if there is repeated performance and that performance isn't successful, then it's not necessarily a quote benefit in the accountability system. At the same time, we want to incent things that we know are right for students to pursue. So yeah, this is, I don't put a finger on the scale, but I want to just help explore all the considerations here.
Well, hey, I have a few thoughts. I've been listening. This is Jermaine Brown in Hattiesburg, and if you all can see my comment in the chat, it was so moved or second that motion, if that was the case what Wendy presented. And my thoughts are this. First, I wanted to respond to, as far as my role in my district, I serve as the CTE director, district test coordinator, and 3 or 4 more hats. So all testing, ALL testing is done the same in our district. And I don't know why that wouldn't be the case for all districts. So whatever we do for EOC, whatever we do for third grade GATE, we're doing the exact same procedures for ACT work keys as well as industry certifications. So that's one. Second, when I saw this, it just reminds me of unintended consequence that happened to our district. There's on the list that she presented, there is a certification certification assessment that is still on the list, but it's not offered anymore by RCU, where our district has made a decision that we're still going to assess those kids because it's doing what's best for kids, and we want those students to have the national certification. So if we're still going to go through the route and pay for it as a district, since RCU isn't going to pay for it. But we want that to be in the accountability model? Yes, and again, from my perspective, in our district perspective, those two that we lost, and again, they're on the list, but they're no longer offered or supported by RCU. Those were our two major areas where our students earn national certification compared to any other program that I have. So those are my thoughts, and I just really wish, and again, I'm speaking selfish because it's my district, but I know it does still can impact others the same. I'm thinking about the industry certification incentive grant that was out there. We had to show proof of passage rates, what have you, in order to get that industry certification. So there's documentation that can be provided to ensure that there are successful attempts. Now, if there's an account that's created for the kid that shows this many attempts, that many attempts, I don't know. I think that can be best practice that's passed on to the industry. So again, those somewhat are my thoughts with it. But again, I'm a victim, I would say, victim of an unintended consequence that happened to my district in losing some points for industry certification on the subsequent years compared to what we received previously.
Those are all good points. I do want to point out, Jermaine, one thing. When that list of industry certifications was approved in October of 2021, it was approved with the intent of, once programs became measured by work-based learning as the Perkins program quality indicator, those will actually sunset off of the list. So any program that moves to work-based learning as a program quality indicator will no longer be on the list. The reason that has not come off the list for this year is because we will not remove an industry certification in a school year where if a school year is in the middle of a school year, we're not going to go in and remove it in the middle of a school year. So the intent there is to actually remove those two that you mentioned for the 23-24. Well, our forward looking attempt is to remove those for the 23-24 school year, because we didn't remove them for the 22-23 school year. And that was primarily because of the transition in CTE director. So I do want to point that out to your point. So.
Are there others that would like to share a perspective about this topic?
Dr. Domaleski, this is Paula. I'll just reiterate the fact that you mentioned earlier about the verification of the data that's reported by districts. We are in the middle of an audit currently, and that seems to be the majority of questions that we're having to address for the auditors now, is how do we verify the data that's entered into MSIS by the local school districts that is utilized in our accountability system. So we know that our corrective action already before we even receive the report is going to have to identify ways in which we will begin doing that for all of the components, graduation rates, et cetera.
Yeah, any data that's entered by the district, we're gonna have to look at a tighter review of, so ACT data entry, graduation, final status entries, enrollment entries, those types of things.
So let me sort of summarize what I've heard so far. It doesn't sound like we really have a central sort of unified position on this as a group. We've heard some very persuasive points of view about why it might be beneficial and what some drawbacks might be. We've heard a suggestion that it may be reasonable to cap it. We've also heard some concerns about the ability to verify the data in a way that would help us to make all the assurances that the state has to. So yeah, and again, so it really becomes a question of, is this something that the group feels strong enough about that it's worth it to stay on top of this topic and to start to develop some implementation strategies to support verification and the like? Or is this something that we feel is best decoupled from the accountability system, stick with the two administrations, and let, let districts continue to do what's in the best interest of students when it comes to multiple attempts beyond the two that the state supports? I guess what I'm searching for here is there a strong point of view about, the principle here of inclusion and accountability that would inspire us to say that we need to devote some resources to implementation? Or is this not that high a priority and is something that we don't need to stay on, continue to pursue?
Chris, this is Christy. After listening to the discussion, I definitely lean towards the later, looking at the two administrations and keeping it streamlined. It has a fairness component of it, in addition to just the ease of reporting. So everybody has two attempts. It's consistent and it eliminates a lot of the back and forth with data verifications, and how we, would treat the unsuccessful attempts and access. So I wouldn't dedicate a lot more time of the task force's efforts on this right now.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Christy. Any other perspectives? Practicing my good listening and wait skills. Well, I should say I'm practicing my skills because they're not good, is what I should have said. Okay, it doesn't, it appears that this conversation's tapered off. Sounds like people have been able to make the contributions that they wanted to make here. I think for current purposes, colleagues, I'll just put in the notes that there was a range of perspectives that was shared about it. I'll list the pros and cons that people gave voice to. Let's either when we get to the close of our meeting today and you want to illuminate priorities for future meetings, if this is something you want us to take back up again, please let us know, or use any other communication channels that you prefer, like reaching out via email to the MDE. But I think for now, I think we're just going to record the range of positions. I didn't hear any strong position to frame a recommendation at this point. If somebody wants to frame one, then let us know. And we'll take cues from the task force about whether and how we pursue it moving forward. So it's sort of a long-winded way of saying we're going to table it for now, unless there are strong feelings that we should take another course. Okay, and again, we can always backpedal if people want to take up topics in the future. So maybe if nothing else, this served as an opportunity to learn a lot about something, do some thinking, do some conversations with colleagues, and we can we'll listen carefully to you about whether and how we take it up in the future. Let's go on then and transition to our last topic. I think we're going to be on pace to adjourn a little early because I don't think this one's going to take a long time. But we will take the time that to hear from the task force for the things that you do have to contribute. What we thought we would do here is, Alan started the meeting by giving us a really comprehensive overview of the Mississippi Accountability System, which I think is a great way to start every year. Here we're going to kind of zoom out a little bit and just talk about accountability broadly. And we're going to do that in service to kind of laying the groundwork for hearing your feedback about what future directions, innovations, considerations that you want to prioritize. It could be something relatively straightforward, such as tweaks to the business rules, or it could be something more substantial. But we thought what we would do is give you a bit of a kind of accountability 101 from a broad perspective, and then we will close the meeting after, and I don't think it'll take me more than 10 minutes or so to go through a few slides here, and then we'll go around the horn and give everybody a chance to weigh in on any closing feedback, particularly as relates to priorities for future topics, and then I think we will be ready to adjourn. So that's our last topic, colleagues. Next slide. So Alan covered this to some extent, so I think I'm overlapping with his really strong remarks. When we think about accountability now and what it could be in the future, we would like to center with what's the promise of accountability, what are we doing it for, what do we hope to get out of it. We hope to continue to signal what outcomes are valued, provide information about school performance with respect to those outcomes, and have a system that allows us to prescribe the conditions, supports, and interventions that improve outcomes. We hope, in the best case, that improvement occurs by incentivizing the right kind of behaviors and actions, providing feedback, and deploying those targeted supports in ways that are going to make a difference. That's pretty easy to say. It's really hard to do well. I say all the time, I think Mississippi is a leader. I think they're on the front foot nationally with accountability. So any conversation we have about improvement, I think, is with the understanding that we're starting from a very strong and stable condition. And I think that's noteworthy and something that's prized. Next slide. We've already covered what ESSA requires, so I think we'll just go on to the next slide. So these, if you want to break down elements of accountability systems, so their core components, this document that was developed in 2007 by CCSSO continues to be a pretty good way to do that. Accountability systems comprise goals, performance indicators, design decisions, consequences, communication support, and then monitoring and support. I wanted to just say a few words about each of those pieces. So next slide. So goals, as we continue to work together, we always want to be explicit about our goals and rationale for any particular revisions. As I said from the start, includes explaining intended purposes and uses, really anticipate any unintended consequences that might be troubling. And I hope that every time that we record our conversations, that we've got a strong rationale we can peg to our recommendation that really keeps the main thing the main thing. Next slide. The sort of building blocks of accountability, these indicators and measures. These are the sources of data that contribute information to that determination. We use the language of indicator to refer to a data element that addresses a key area. So for example, academic achievement or even academic achievement in mathematics. And then a measure or metric is where we get a little more technical. It becomes the operational definition. So for example, the percent of full academic year students scoring proficient or higher on MAP. So you can see in the first case, we say what we value academic achievement. When we get to the measure place, we operationally define that. And we hope as we do so, we're continuing to stay strongly linked to the goal or rationale behind it. Next slide. These design decisions, this is where the magic happens. I guess there's two ways to say it. The devil's in the details or God's in the details. I guess it depends on which version you prefer, but the details matter. And this is where we get to questions we've already taken up in the course of this meeting. To what extent do we want to be standardized versus flexible? How do you weight and combine these things? What's good enough performance? That gets into like what's the performance threshold for an indicator overall? How do you handle exceptions? So there's a lot of moving parts, and we rely on this task force to help us navigate through those moving parts in a way that stays tethered to the main things. Next slide. And then consequences and supports. We always want to have an eye for how those results are going to be used, how we can avoid those unintended outcomes, what supports. Sometimes you hear, particularly my colleagues and I at the Center for Assessment, we talk a lot about theories of action, which just really means like a logic model or a very clear statement about how everything's supposed to work together to create the outcomes we care about. In general, I think many of us are skeptical that simply reporting and hoping good things happen is a good theory of action. I think that's an incomplete theory of action, which is why we just always lean into accountability conversations. Do we say, well, what kind of supports or reactions, conditions, resources do we think should accompany a strong solution when things, when the outcomes that we hope for aren't achieved? Next slide. And then reports can help make the accountability system results actionable. This is something that I think the department's done a really good job with and just continues to get better. I'm very impressed. It can include not just the data, but supports that are outside the system to help people understand and use it well. We always talk about distinguishing data from information. Data is things like spreadsheets and graphs. Information is takeaways that help you inform actions that help students improve. Next slide. And then system evaluation, and this part of what we do with the task force is part of what we do regularly with the technical advisory committee is ongoing monitoring, not just of the outcomes, the student achievement improving, which should accompany any thoughtful implementation of accountability, but of the features. Are the accountability indicators, are they reliable? Are they valid? Are they fair? And both of those questions support our ongoing evaluation of the system. And as I noted, the accountability task force is a big part of that. Next slide. So you might be wondering, like, just stepping back and looking broadly, what are some promising practices that people are talking about nationwide? You know, what are things that people have on their mind when it comes to enhancing accountability practices? In my conversations, I've noticed there's a continued heavy focus on equity and fairness. And that covers everything from very transparent group reporting to initiatives to close gaps, to address conditions and opportunity to learn. So that another way to say that might be not just outcomes, but address inputs. And there's ways to do that that don't necessarily have to be pegged to the ESSA system. And so I want to make sure that's clear as well. We're hearing conversations about including broad range of factors associated with improved student outcomes. A lot of times you hear people say we need to right size the role of academic achievement and accountability, but at the same time, I think everybody would agree that broadening those factors should be coherent with academic achievement, not necessarily incompatible. And that hopefully stands to reason. We want to develop and specify effective supports and interventions. I think we've got some work to do as a field to be clearer about that. So that's another promising practice. Supporting appropriate interpretation and use. Sometimes you hear people use the words like data literacy. I think we can get some mileage out of that as we enhance accountability practices. We've talked about enhancing reporting systems and ongoing system evaluation and refinement. And the next slide, I'm almost done. Thanks for your patience here. I wanted to acknowledge that these conversations about sort of the future of accountability almost always interact with some tensions. And here are just three that I've noticed happen a lot in my conversations with accountability professionals. The first is this idea of continuity versus change. I've already, in the course of this meeting, given you the phrase, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. And again, Mississippi has a strong tradition of stability, which I think has been to its benefit in promoting improved outcomes. But at the same time, we never want to be closed off to innovation. But we've got to minimize disruption when we do that. So that's one tension I think we're gonna continue to encounter as we talk about future topics with this task force. Complexity versus simplicity. As we attempt to create more comprehensive systems that address a range of consideration, complexity always increases. But at the same time, I think many people will argue persuasively that there's value in very straightforward solutions that are easy to explain to a wide range of stakeholders. Some people might say, taken to an extreme, accountability systems feel like Rube Goldberg machines. They're just complicated. Only people like us can really understand what's happening, and that limits their effectiveness because we can't talk to wide audiences about them with clarity. So really threading that needle. But the more we say, let's keep simple, the less we're equipped to deal with nuances. And so that's just a tension that I think we're going to encounter as we continue to have our conversations. And the standardization versus flexibility. It's very enticing to say, let's create special circumstances that deal with exceptional situations. But the more we do that, the less we're going to be able to compare both within year and across year. And I think many people value that as part of the system. So that's another tension that I just wanted to name because I think we're going to interact with it as we continue to look ahead for the future of accountability in Mississippi. And then I'm almost done here. Next slide, please. Okay. So that was just a little bit of an accountability 101 broadly. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I'm hearing nationally, some of the tensions that I know are going to come up, and really just to tee up feedback from this task force. And I'd love to learn from you, what are your priorities this year? What topics do you think we should address and why? And I just want to go into listening mode here. I don't want to opine or unpack any of them now, but I think the MDE team and myself, we just wanted to open the floor to hear what's on your mind, and it'll help us to really plan and prioritize as we move forward with this task force. So I think instead of me just going down the roster and going person by person, I think I just want to open the floor, and I'm just going to take notes and listen to your contributions. So I'm happy to take any clarifying questions, but otherwise, I'd love to close the meeting by hearing your advice about priorities for the future of accountability in Mississippi.
I'll start off if I may. One of the things that I've seen over the years since we've had this current accountability model, and you spoke of if we want to measure change, don't change the measure. And you talked about, but we still want to innovate at the same time. And what I've seen is everything that a new proponent of this model that we shove everything that comes out into the current model. For example, when we started, we had the model the way that it existed. And then we had the acceleration and different components that was added to the model. Then you got the college and career readiness. Okay, it's added to this model. Now you got the work keys. We add, and you got the industry certificate. We add the EL component. Okay, we modified the model to add the EL component. Everything that comes out that we need to measure, we seem to cram it into this current model. And I was just wondering, was there, as we innovate, why does everything have to be crammed into this current model? The districts can't, and I know we got regulations, Mr. Barrow, and different things that we have to do and measure, but does everything have to be measured that we innovate and come out with in this current accountability model? Is there a way that districts who meet these other academic indicators receive other tags of distinction and or something with the district, as because there could be 5 other things over the next few years when we talk about innovating and improving the model, and we constantly cramming it. And now we're taking, instead of 2.5 points from each spot, now we're taking 3 points, or we're taking 5 points to constantly add components to the model. I just think the model is jam-packed. We got enough to deal with in this current model. And I would just like to see it stay and other things that come out, that we look for other ways to recognize districts. That's just my opinion.
Thank you for that. That's a really well articulated perspective. I appreciate that.
Dr. Domaleski, I just wanted to recognize that Dr. Benton has joined the meeting.
Oh, I'm so glad you joined us, Dr. Benton. Would you like to make any remarks to the group?
No, I am so sorry. I was just joining, but the good news for you all, I bet you got a lot accomplished, right?
I think we have had very productive meetings so far. Yes, ma'am.
That's great. And I don't know who all is on. I know who was invited, but I just want to personally thank all of you, and of course you, Chris, and others for giving of your time and sharing with us your best thinking, because you are the closest to the students, and you raise questions and things that help us all get better at providing and ensuring that every student in Mississippi has that high quality education they deserve. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Benton. I appreciate you joining, and thanks for your kind remarks.
Thank you.
Other input about priorities for accountability this year?
This is something that we would like to think about, because it's happening more often than it should, where the piece in the accountability about the 75% of a calendar year. We're beginning to have so many children that don't fall under that category, which may help or even provides maybe a liability or an asset to a school or school district. So I think with that, looking at those components of the 75% of the calendar year, that may be a good topic for us to discuss, because like I said, we have children who are leaving after Christmas, and then the window opens in April. So they haven't completed 75%, depending on how their calendars are, of a particular school year. So it's their scores, it'll be for the district, but it won't go towards the school. So that's something that I'm seeing a lot of with the moving back and forth, especially of elementary school children.
I think what I hear you saying is mobility of students impacting who's included in our determinations. So we should take that.
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that comment.
And piggybacking off of what Alicia just said, that's the same for our graduation rate as well, of how those students are calculated within our rate. Because we have some students who may come to us mid-year during their sophomore year. And so it's kind of hard to determine whether or not we're going to get the credit from them graduating from us. And then some of them stay all the way up to their junior year, and then they leave and go somewhere else. So that's another topic that we may need to discuss as well. Looking at how high schools especially can get credit for graduation rates.
Thank you for that. I'll be sure to note that. Hey, Alan, while we continue to take comments from the task force, can we go ahead and just close out the presentation? I can just see people a little better as we talk.
This is Bradley from Oxford again. As I think back about the very first slide that we saw today when it talked about the vision, of the Department of Education, the two words are college and workforce. And I think I would challenge the group of us to look past our current accountability system and outcomes in our current accountability systems and ask ourselves the question, are we getting the long-term outcomes that we want for our students from this system? And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the Oxford School District, we have anywhere between 85 and 90% of our students that go to college. Yet of those 85 to 90%, about 55% of our students finish with a degree after 5 or 6 years, right? There's a metric on the Mississippi report card right now that talks about our students in Mississippi that enroll in junior college, that only about 32% of them pass all of their coursework their first year of junior college. I think we have to start asking ourselves if all of these things that we're measuring, if we look past those outcomes to the next phase in the life of our students, being college and the workforce, are we measuring the right things that dictates their success? And I think there's some metrics out there when you look at National Clearinghouse and you look at some of the data that's on our state report card that we're not. I don't think we can pigeonhole ourselves into just looking to the end of the high school career when we're looking at these accountability measures. I think we're missing an opportunity to make sure there's future success for our kids if we close ourselves off in that fashion. So that would be my challenge to the group.
Thank you for that. That's an excellent comment. Gives us a lot of area for us to think about, really more fully capturing the range of things that will help us make a stronger link between what we care about and what we're seeing in the data. Yeah.
And piggybacking off of what Ms. Angela Birch just put in, that chronic absenteeism, I remember when there used to be, when I was in school, I remember it plain as day, after 12 absences, there were things in place, especially as far as children, school, their performance with the children. I think when we got away from that and parents not being held accountable, which, being a dead horse with that, we have more children who they miss, and it's at the helm of the parents without any repercussions, because as long as they show up for the 95% of testing, we won't miss that window. But still, I'm like what the superintendent was just saying of Oxford. We need to make sure we're measuring the success, and if we're instilling in children early on that it's okay to miss school without any repercussions, and parents as well, holding them accountable, then we're putting out leaders who are going to miss work quite often. But that may be a dead horse that we're beating. But when he challenges with that, if she said chronic absenteeism, it's becoming really, really bad, especially if you don't have a truancy officer in your district.
Thank you for that. I'll make sure to make that prominent in the notes. Thank you.
Ms. Connolly, I'll say that and then I'll be quiet. I think what Ms. Connolly said is the reason why that you see districts that are going to a community-based report card or scorecard that do measure some of those things, like the idea of chronic absenteeism, like the idea of community service, like the idea of participation in extracurricular activities that we know help build executive function. I think you see communities going to those models because they're lacking in our current accountability system, yet we know that they're important.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate all the rich feedback. Keep it coming, colleagues. I want to learn from all of you.
I have two things I'd like to share. I actually spoke to a principal last night from Mobile County,
And he told me how the accountability model and attendance are actually tied together in Alabama. So I'm not quite sure how that's done, but their daily attendance and accountability is a big part of their model. So that's kind of something to think about. I mean, obviously, I know a lot of people wouldn't want that, but it would be an incentive, you know, for principals and school leaders to push attendance a lot more than they currently do. And then something else regarding dual credit on college and career readiness. So in order to be college and career ready in math, you have to have a 22. And then in order to make it into the dual credit college algebra class, you have to have an 18. Well, there's a gap there that we're seeing an issue with. He was just speaking of, you know, students that were in dual credit classes, were they being successful in college and so forth. Well, a gap that we're seeing is, so to be in the essentials of math class, you have to have a 15 to an 18. So if you're college and career ready at 22, but to go in college algebra, you have to have an 18. That gap from 18 to 21, are they really truly ready for college algebra? We're not putting them in essentials to math. So, you know, we're seeing a huge issue there with those students in that little, you know, 18 to 21 gap. But per the requirements, they're not eligible for that essentials math class that they can be getting for free in high school. So I think that's something that we need to consider.
Thank you for that. I've noted that comments about, again, another consideration to look at attendance and the gap between thresholds for mathematics and readiness. So that's helpful advice.
Hey, this is Ryan. I'm going to admit this one's hard and I don't know, but I'm going to bring it up because I don't think we do it correctly. It's funny that we talked about school improvement for the first section today. Currently, and I know the N count of 10 is the, you know, accepted standard, and, you know, I believe me, I understand that. However, we're leaving out the majority of Mississippi schools from being able to be identified for school improvement. And they do have students with disabilities, which is the main area that people are identified. And because of the N count 10 rule for every component. You only honestly have a small portion of Mississippi that can even be identified, especially on the 1,000 scale. It's about 40 of 240. Think about that for a second. And we're going to say that we're truly measuring students with disabilities across the state. We're not. We're only doing it in large schools. We've got to go to some sort of percentage-based system. I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I admit it's completely hard. But for us to say that we are meeting ESSA's requirements for the entire state of Mississippi for those subgroups and specifically students with disabilities, we're not. We're only punishing large schools, and we're looking at the students in large schools. Everybody else is not even in the game. They can't even be identified. You leave out so many. Somebody report the percentage of people who are eligible on those scales, like I just talked about, and it would. And if the USD saw that, that would be a problem. So I just feel we've got to look at that. We're totally under identifying, and I know that's not probably popular with smaller schools because it's one of those things. And I know I'm in a large district that has nothing but large schools, but that's just being honest. It's a very, very it's all about your population, and you don't even get looked at if you don't have a certain number. So I just think if there's anything we can look at there, and I get it's a tough one. I completely admit it.
Well, I appreciate you bringing the tough ones to us, Ryan. That's yeah. There's a couple of ideas we can pursue. Again, we should pursue them with, you know, with our priorities in mind. But you know, there's states that do consolidated subgroups. They do multi-year averages. There are strategies that we can look at to see if it aligns with our principles and helps us. I hear your voice, you know, really for equity, and I think that's important. So good, thank you. I'm seeing the comments in the chat. Thanks for that. Components associated with workforce preparation noted. Thanks for the additional text there to
have one thing I would like to kind of see is that we kind of take a little, much closer look into the language in the accountability standards or model to ensure we have a clear understanding of them. A couple of times I know I've had to email Alan to ask about it, or even go over to Ryan to, and I appreciate everyone's, answering my emails, but sometimes we see like the slash, which in my mind means an or, and it came back with no, they have to have this and this. So just making sure we flesh out the language to ensure that everyone kind of really understands what this rule is saying. Even when I look at the lowest performing students, I know the accountability rule in my sleep. I can read it to you and tell you that, I find my boundaries score and all that. But, my question came where we have a lot of students that may have been retained in a certain grade, or they automatically, so it's just a lot of things I would like to see fleshed all the way out to ensure that all of our districts have a clear understanding of the standards, not just me as well.
Thank you for that. Vote for more clarity and transparency. It's hard to argue against that. Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Chris, let me just say something real quick on that. I mentioned earlier, we do try to do clarifications to the business rules each year, based on, things that come up during the accountability run. So if you have something in particular that you want some clarification around, if you'll email me, I'll add it to my list. Because we definitely want the business rules to be as clear as possible. Thank you.
Mr. Burrow, that was one, and maybe you can answer. And I was stuck on it as me and my team were working on the rules around the graduation rates and the cohorts, and we just were not certain. And this may be something you want me to email you on. Just let me know. But when you talk about students in your cohort, and there was a piece in there about students who were incarcerated, but where I was unclear was, it seems that if the language was saying if a student has been sentenced by a judge, then and incarcerated, that there may be some documentation or whatever you're saying to have students in that case removed from a cohort. But if they're have been arrested and they are just locked up pending, for example, I got a kid that's probably going to be in my next cohort, on next year's cohort, that is charged with capital murder. That court case could take 2 years from now, but that kid doesn't have a bail and is locked up. But the language would mean that kid would be counted as a dropout for me because he has not been sentenced by a judge. Am I right? Or is that something that needs to be clarified, or is that something we need to revisit?
That's going to be addressed in federal guidance for the 4-year adjusted cohort calculation. So if you'll just email me on that one, I can find that for you or help you with it.
So that's not one. My question is, that one that we have, it would be a topic of discussion for this committee on the state side because we have our rules, but that's under the umbrella of the federal, or is that all based on federal guidelines and there's nothing that we really can do about it?
Right. We use the federal definition, so it's something I'd have to look up in federal guidance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other suggestions for future priorities for our task force? We have a terrific list. Thank you. I think we did have a very productive meeting. Appreciate your guidance on everything that we talked about today. I think we've got a lot of clarity to help us move forward on the amendment from our earlier conversation. I think we did a pretty good job of distilling the issues on the industry certification and helping us to at least get to a place where if we take it up again, we do so from a much more informed perspective. And I'm looking forward to going through this list of priorities with the MDE team as we think about our next meeting together, and really trying to elevate as many of these as we can, as quickly as we can, so that we can follow up on your advice. I don't think we have a time set now for the next meeting, but we'll be in communication with you as soon as possible about that. Our ambition is to see you in person. Personally look forward to that. So I hope that we can meet in Jackson before too long and continue our important work. I know we're ahead of schedule, but I bet I'm not disappointing you too bad if we start to wrap up here. Can you think of anything, Alan, Paula, or anybody else from the department before we adjourn?
Just want to say thank you again to everyone. I don't have anything. I'm sure after the meeting ends, I'll think of something, but we will work to get a February date and a location so that we can be in person and hopefully have Dr. Taylor join us. I know he's going to have a very busy schedule when he arrives next week, but he's aware of the task force and looking forward to hear about the work that you're doing.
All right, thanks everybody. Until we convene again, best wishes, and we'll go ahead and adjourn.